Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation webinar series. My name is Abbas Salawala. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Galen Data, and I'll be your host today. Today, we'll be hearing from Rowan Nidd, Head of Regulatory Affairs at MedTech and MedTech at NNIT, for a conversation on bringing a product to the market and what you need to know and when. We'll discuss timelines and key focus areas as development progresses, along with regulatory milestones required to bring a device to the market. But first few housekeeping items and a little information on Galen Data. Galen Data provides a FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. We are ISO 13440 485 certified, and the product on AWS is HITRUST certified. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, our goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of cost, while shaving months of development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics. As we are going through this, if you have any questions, you can type those in the Q&A sections available on the sidebar, either on the left or right, depending on the client you use. We'll ask those questions to our guests at the end, or if appropriate, I'll bring these up during our conversation. There's also some handouts on the control panel with more information on Galen Data and a white paper on cloud connectivity. Also, a reminder that a copy of this webinar will be sent to you via email, most likely tomorrow. That being said, let me introduce our guest, Rowan Nidd. Rowan leads the Regulatory Affairs and Medical Devices Group at NNIT. His focus is on driving process improvement, optimization, and digital innovation through digital transformation within the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. He's a seasoned consultant and extensive experience in bringing new products to market through effective regulatory and quality strategies, process design, and management. Welcome, Rowan. Nice to have you on our webinar. Maybe you can start with a short introduction on NNIT.
Yeah, absolutely, Abbas, and thank you very much for having me. We've known each other for a while now, and it's a great opportunity to get together and share a bit of the knowledge that we've built up together. So thank you very much. So if I just start, as said, I work for NNIT, so a little bit about them. If you just want to jump to the next slide. So NNIT is a global company, headquartered in Copenhagen and Denmark, but we have offices across Europe, the US, and in Asia as well. So truly a global company. The next slide, please. As Abbas mentioned, we work across pharma and medtech, but within the medtech space, where we can really add value, particularly, is with supporting medical device companies. Both we do work a lot with the larger, but also with the smaller companies as well, and that's very much around, as it says, minimizing the risk and costly delays in your market entry failures, and just keeping you on track for that submission. Because the main thing, and we'll touch on it a lot more in the presentation, delays equal cost equals delays equal cost and loss of market share. So if you can jump to the next slide, please. So before jumping into it, I just want to touch a little bit more on why this is so important, and give a little bit more of the strategy for this presentation. So with regards to the presentation, I'll get through this, and then what I'm really looking forward to at the end of us is obviously you and I have a chance to discuss some of the points brought up and continue some of the great discussions we've been having earlier. So if you can just jump to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I love this analogy because when we think, particularly bringing a new product to market, and particularly for startups, there's three fundamental points to bringing bringing a product to market. I use the stool analogy because without any of the three, the stool collapses. So these are the three legs of bringing a product to market. So there's obviously funding, there's the device technology, And then the one that's often forgotten about or pushed to the back is the regulatory compliance. But as said, because most of the people, you're excited about the device, receiving the funding, but as said, the regulatory often gets pushed to the back, and without it, you won't unfortunately get to market. So that's more what I'm going to focus this talk on. So if you can jump to the next slide. So some of the challenges that we see in the industry, and I'm sure you're seeing yourselves, is that there is less capital investment out there. We're seeing between 30 and 40% less investment across the EU and the US, and that's directly tied to the fact that the medical device industry is becoming more risky, and that's down to a lot of the new regulations that are coming out. There's, if we look at the EU particularly, there's EU MDR, IVDR, AI Act, GDPR, and a lot of other legislations. And this is really adding unexpected costs, prolonged timelines, which ultimately increase the risk, which is, as we can see, reducing some of the appetite for funding. That's why, as I said, we focus very much on reducing that regulatory risk, and by partnering with experienced people, and not just people like ourselves, but others within the industry, like yourselves at Galen and others, this gives you the opportunity to really lower that risk. So if you can, next slide, please. So, as said, drilling down into the as an entrepreneur with a startup, we've discussed the complex regulatory landscape, and it's only going to be more complex and more stringent. We can see that already in some of the proposed new legislation. So, as said, it's getting more and more stringent, and companies are needing to comply with these more stringent rules. This is leading to unexpected development costs, so often roadblocks by the legislation, having to work around them. We're seeing a lot more, devices now having to have clinical trials and that sort of thing, which is increasing the development costs. And because of this, because of these a lot of the new burdens, there's also there is a qualified resource shortage within the market that we are seeing. So, and that's not just qualified within being able to address the task, but if we think about for smaller startups, that's also being able people with the right mindset, being able to work within that entrepreneurial environment, because it's not just about being able to do the specific task. You also have to, and knowing the specific regulations and other things, you also have to have an eye on the business requirements. So you have to actually have a broader knowledge than a lot of the qualified resources do for other tasks. So obviously that adds a level of complexity, but it's something to think about when you are relying on qualified resource or other experts as well. And all of these are things to have in the back of your mind, during the process of bringing your product to market. Next slide, please. So now we've talked about the the sort of some of the problems out there. Let's talk about what you can do about it and actually get into some of the steps that you need to do and think about when bringing your product to market. So please, next slide, please. So as mentioned, I work primarily within the EU market, so within Europe. So a lot of these are this is directed towards that market. But the same concepts certainly apply to the US and to other markets as well. So one of the questions get asked a lot is, how long does it take to achieve a CE mark or FDA approval? So so everyone says it depends, and it does. In general, it should take between 6 and 24 months. This is obviously if the stars aligned and you have all of your you have everything lined up and ready to go. We do obviously know of cases where this hasn't been the case, where it's taken anything up to 5 years, which is unfortunate. But in a perfect world, it should be anywhere between 12 to 24 months. But there are obviously a lot of factors that influence this. Some of those device related are the intended purpose and the commercial strategy of the device. Now, this is something, Abbas, you and I could chat about. I could probably do a webinar in itself on, talk for hours on. And it is simply because it is one of the areas where, we see so many problems for companies. It is the most fundamental part of bringing a product to market, and certainly in the early stages. And by intended purpose, that is what sets. So your intended purpose that comes into the classification completely goes hand in hand with your commercial strategy. Does it need to be a medical device? If it is, what class does it need to be? If your class is too light, you might not. You may fail at registration. If it's too heavy, you end up doing a lot of extra work and cost that you may not need to do. So these two things, are often overlooked, but not given as much time and attention that they deserve, but really should be hammered out in the beginning. Classification, as said, the EU 1, 2, 3, or ABCD if it's an IVDR product, and then obviously similar within the US. Slightly different in many ways, but very similar. There is also, it's not just about the EU MDR, as I mentioned, GDPR, the AI Act, and others legislation that we're seeing both within Europe, particularly within Europe, but also across the US as well. And then how much, when we talk about clinical innovation, this ties a little bit back to the classification and intended purpose, but how novel is it? And this is important because it also, again, when we think of the US with predicate devices and other things as well. And access to clinical investigation sites. This is, as said, we're seeing a lot more devices now needing clinical investigations, and it is access to these sites can be tricky and expensive, and most of the time you're working with partners on it. So that is something that needs to be prepared ahead of time. Regards the company, so obviously access to personnel, we've discussed this before. It's not just about having experience, it's about having the right experience. Software decisions, and this is another one we see, so focusing things like your QMS selection, your software integration, implementing and maintaining a QMS system. One of the things that we often see, and I'm going to touch on this quite a lot more in the presentation with regard to softwares, is a lot of companies, and I know some of the time it's to save money, but a lot of the time it's just an unawareness. They will wait too long with implementing a software to help them and assist them with their QMS, the clinical trials, their data, that sort of thing. So that is something that needs to be taken into consideration. And then certainly in Europe, the notified bodies, they need to be engaged with early. We have it's better now, but we have seen time waits of up to 18 months to be able to engage with a notified body. That obviously seriously affects that 6 to 24 month timeline. So next slide, please. So then focusing on the timelines themselves, I've broken it down into the technology and obviously the regulatories. So the regulatory is the teal element of it, and that's what I'll be focusing on in this in this presentation. The, the interesting thing to note here, this is on the 2-year timeline, but not only, not only are these events sequential and need to be done in a certain order, there's also a lot of parallel activity here. So, which obviously needs to be managed and can be quite a daunting task. So the other thing to notice as well is that where we see problems with companies is that they don't necessarily have this timeline up front, and they don't, so that we see a lot of effort being wasted sometimes in things not being started early enough, or so that also draws out the timeline, because a lot of these things can be run in parallel, but sometimes they're done sequentially, and that does drag out that timeline as well. So yeah, and I'll take each of these points in the following slides. So everything from discovery and concept development right down to product life cycle management. So yeah, if you can jump to the next slide, please. So discovery, concept, and development. So intended purpose, I touched on that. So this is the first stage of of developing a medical device. And I've talked about intended purpose a little bit before, but again, this is crucial, and I can't stress this enough, for how the device is regulated. The different class of device and types of device are subject to varying regulations and standards. And what we see is people either underestimating or, in most cases, overestimating their device, which then means that they then end up with a far higher regulatory burden than they need. So this intended purpose is really something that needs to be tied down early and solidified. Not to say that it can't be changed as part of your strategy, but it certainly needs to be solidified early so that you know the standard that you're working to. Then the qualification and classification, that's very much plays into the intended purpose. The two are related. As said, once you know the intended purpose, then you can start the qualification and classification into it, and then start the regulatory submission pathway appropriate to that device. The design and development. So the design plan then needs to be, so once you know your classification and your regulatory pathway, you need the design plan and the protocols, as well as review reports, user requirements, supplier qualifications, and also the need for a qualified team to be able to deal with that. And something else, the last is the market potential. That plays a little bit into the classification, but more so into your market strategy. And that's looking at access to the market. So, are you going to do that through distributors, importers? Are there similar devices out there? Price points and that sort of thing. So that plays it is something that is slightly overlooked. A lot of the time people are passionate about the device and understand that, but you do need to understand the logistics of the market that you're going into, because that also then plays into, as I said, does it need to be a medical device? What is the market you're going after? Is it a healthcare market? Is it prescriptions? Is there more money in an over-the-counter device? And then something that I just want to highlight as well, certainly in the EU, the person responsible for regulatory compliance. This is a mandatory role within a company. And what we often see is that this sometimes just gets given to someone as a title, but actually there's quite a lot of work that goes with it. So they are responsible for the technical documentation, the clinical trials, and everything else that goes along with that. So, and then obviously if it's already on the market, then there's they're in charge of the post-market activities as well. So it's just something to be aware of, and ideally someone who's got experience in the field. Next slide, please. So moving on to the next step, which is the preclinical. So the preclinical stages. So this is, and I'll talk through the stages on the right because they do have defined. It is a defined process, but this is about ensuring that the device is safe and effective before clinical trials, if necessary, and also, just that it's safe and effective. I've talked about over implementation, but this is also where we sometimes see people, how should we say, over implementing it, which then leads to quite a large clinical burden. That then, as we mentioned, which then raises the risk of over testing, over documentation, again increases your costs and your timelines. Within this preclinical, we're looking at rigorous testing and analysis to validate the design, performance, and safety. That's very much what this is about. And when this is where your RA and QA managers really, earn their money, so to speak, and making sure that these are conducted efficiently and obviously to the compliant regulatory standards, which without which you won't get to clinical trials should you need them. So the steps involved in the preclinical stage. So obviously there's a clinical development plan, biological evaluation, safety and performance testing, a risk assessment, and usability and clinical evaluation. And as said, this is very much around the safety of the device before we even get to clinical trials. We're not going to test something that is potentially dangerous. Next slide, please. So before obviously we can test a device in, for example, a clinical trial environment, if it is going that way, we need to manufacture it. We also need, be it prototypes or be it a sample run for example, clinical trials. And this is again something that's sometimes overlooked because it's seen as moved out. It's normally done by third parties, by vendors, contract manufacturers, that sort of thing. But there is still a large burden on the companies with regards to the manufacturing documentation. Just as a point of note, for software devices, they still have to go through this process. Obviously, they're not always manufacturing a device themselves, but obviously there is requirements within this step, and that's mainly to cover things like software of unknown
provenance.
Provenance, thank you, Abbas. My mind went blank. Other suppliers obviously release and updates, and we'll talk a little bit more around release and updates when we talk about the lifecycle management. But when we look at the three stages within this, there's very much obviously the planning. So, this determines which manufacturers you're going to use, which equipment, quality control points, which resources, timelines, and all of the above. This all needs to go into your planning stage. Bear in mind that you've worked a lot of this out already in your preclinical stage with regards to safety assessments and quality assessments. The validation of that. So there's also, you need to look at the validation protocols, reports, also that the tests that you do on it are conducted according to the predetermined specifications and quality standards. And then obviously determine your strategy for this, but also the frequency of the testing and everything you need to do to maintain your device with the manufacturers. And then, as said, final production. So obviously, depending on the scale of what you're doing at the moment, but then you still need to establish quality assurance records and effective management of the manufacturing site itself. So there is still work for companies involved here, with particularly around, like I say, the planning, manufacturing, and then obviously the documentation of all of that. The manufacturers normally will be able to assist you with this, but it is something that you need. You need to be able to do a lot of it yourself, just so that you understand what needs to go into your submissions. Next slide, please. So we now get to now that we have the device, so to speak, we're able to do clinical investigations if the device needs clinical investigations. This is normally done. By CROs, so contract manufacturing, clinical research organizations, and there are a lot on the market who run clinical trials. It's, unless you're quite experienced in it, it's not generally something that device manufacturers do themselves. So just to talk you again through the stages of it, there's the rationale, and this is the initial assessment. So this is looking into whether you actually need a clinical trial, and if you don't, then why. So there needs to be a rationale around it. So the plan, protocols, and ethics approval. Either way, certainly if you are doing a clinical trial, all your documentation needs to go to an ethics committee and the relevant sites and authorities for approval. And this is quite complex, but there are certain steps within it. But this is to get both ethics approval, but also from the authorities themselves to say that yes, your clinical trials meet the right standards, and that they give you permission to go ahead with them. Trial recruitment and informed consent. So again, as said, sometimes this is done by CROs, but most of the time it's done by CROs or specialized clinical trial groups. But there is, with regards to patient recruitment, this is the important thing to think about here is, and this should come out in your clinical investigation rationale as well, is what patients or people do you need within your clinical trials? And this comes back a little bit to market access. So if you're going, different countries, different regions have different criteria. So if you're going US first, they have different requirements for population the dynamics, as does Europe, as does different countries. So it's something to think about, certainly with your recruitment for the clinical trials. But this needs to be really clear in your rationale as well. And then I'll talk about the data. It also we've talked about informed consent as well, but that'll come. But just that'll normally be dealt with by the as part of the clinical trial. But the reason I mention it slightly within the data collection assessment, because this is something where you really have to think about it. A lot of CROs or a lot of clinical trial companies will have their own software that they use for running the clinical trials. The other thing too is, and this is where it's so important, whereas I've said at the bottom, strongly consider e-vendors for the collection and management of clinical trial evidence, safety, and performance data. Where, particularly in the current environment with a focus on GDPR, cybersecurity, and everything else, one of the things that we see, and Abbas, I know you mentioned it in your intro, this is where we see device companies almost having to turn themselves into IT companies if they try and do this themselves. My advice is do look at vendors for all of this data collection. It's simply cheaper, quicker, and easier than trying to do it yourself, and certainly safer and a lot less risky. And then once you have this data, obviously, the assessment, the reporting, then these final reports are prepared and submitted to the relevant authorities. So next slide, please. This brings us on to the technical documentation, which is a very, very crucial part of, well, they're all crucial, but this is certainly crucial, and one of the things where we see quite a lot of issues when companies submit to notified bodies or health authorities, depending on the market or the country. When we talk, people talk about tech docs, which is technical documentation. It is quite a burdensome task. It contains hundreds of documents, depending on the device type. Obviously, the lighter the lower the device classification, the less burdensome they are. But it certainly is. It is certainly a lot of effort that goes into producing these documentation. And this is certainly where, if you haven't, considered some form of document management system and data management system in the past, certainly this is where you will want to consider it. So the three sort of what I would call points to consider with regards to your technical documentation. Strategic expertise, I've called it, and this is within the regulatory requirements. So these are complex documents, incredibly time-consuming to write, and do require, I would say, a deep regulatory and quality knowledge to write. It also needs to be complete and accurate. And as said, this is where, from experience, we see, as I pointed out, the statistics earlier on, 75% of current submissions have some form of inaccuracies or are considered incomplete. And this is primarily where we see this. Within the quality assurance, so establishing efficient technical documentation processes to cover all of your device lifecycle. And by lifecycle, this isn't just getting it to market. There's obviously a whole lot of post-market activities that need to be done as well. So this is where your systems need, again, we get, and I appreciate, particularly with passionate entrepreneurs, they really, really focus on getting the device to market. But there is a whole device life cycle once it's on the market, and this is where your quality assurance and your systems to manage that really do come in. And as said, leads to predictable outcomes and the ability to continually improve, and regulatory navigation. So it's not just about the regulatory requirements when writing these technical documentation. There is also something, industry best practice. And this is also, and for those of you involved in the European, there is the European markets, there can be differences between the notified bodies in the way, submissions are dealt with. So by having, how should we say, these expertise, both within both navigating the regulatory requirements and the industry best practice, and also ideally experience with the particular notified body that you choose, it really helps with that, with that right first time submission, which is it's what we all want to get the product to market first time. Next slide, please. So we'll getting to the submission to health authorities and market access. As said again, I've started with there are a variety of IT tools and capabilities. So please do consider some of these when looking at this. And part of this is because I've talked about using the same three sort of focus areas with regards to efficient submission. It's not just about the tech docs writing them, but obviously, but there's an element, but it has to be, the library itself has to be validated both for content and metadata, and then formulated and submitted in the correct format for the said notified body or health authority. And as said, this is where the use of technology can really make your lives easier and reduce that risk of problems. Rapid issue resolution. This is something that again is a little, call it a trick, but it should be something that is front of mind for everyone. When once you've submitted to the health authority, the authority or the notified body, it is an iterative and it is a very live process, and it's imperative to really stay on top of it and address any queries or questions that you may receive promptly. So just to hammer that home, that the authorities, many authorities have an internal process rule that any inquiry is resolved within 24 hours. So that's an email, they ask you a question, you resolve it, or a phone call, or however you're dealing with them. Don't lead to a non-conformity. If you can deal with them in 24 hours, it's not a non-conformity, which is great and vital, because with more than 3 non-conformities, they cancel your submission process, which means you have to start again. So, it's a very easy win to avoid non-conformities is really just staying on top of this issue resolution. And then your pre-registration readiness. So this is getting ready for bringing your product onto the market once it receives certification. So for this, you need to ensure that all your contracts, so your manufacturing contracts, your distributor contracts, all of that sort of thing, your marketing, your market access, all of that is in place, quality agreements, as I mentioned, importers, distributors. And then as a final point, you do need to ensure that you register in the databases and ensure that all activities needed to start selling your product are done and done correctly. And you're obviously, because now your product's on the market, that your post-market activities are initiated. So the next slide, please, Abbas. So product lifecycle management and end of life. So we've talked about now products on the market or it's coming to the end of life. Again, a lot of you I know are just thinking about getting your product to market. For those of you with your product on the market, you're probably not thinking about end of life. But it is something that just needs to go into your planning. So with regard to post-market activities, this refers to everything once your product's on the market. And there are a lot of regulatory requirements, so they can be both, well, they're certainly continual, and they can both be cumbersome. So, but they need to be planned, they need to be submitted and approved by the authorities. So you'd have to have a post-marketing plan that is approved. If we think about software here, if you think about a device or software device or even software as a medical device, all of the updates that come with that, as previous versions are removed from the market or we have updates, all of this needs to be built into that plan. The other, and there, so as mentioned, there is a lot more focus now on post-market activities, and as part of this, it's not just about a plan, but it's also about ensuring the ongoing safety and effectiveness and regulatory compliance of medical devices. So, so that they're continually safe, fit for purpose, and effective. Now, although there's a regulatory burden to that, from a company perspective, it's, if you're doing this well, it's a real, it is a real, how should we say, strategic advantage, because it does enable you to continually improve, continually better your product. And this can be through real world data, real world evidence, reporting back, and it allows you to improve and adapt your product as the market itself adapts. And then when we start talking about end of life, so as we mentioned, as it starts its end of life, or a device is sold, or it's decommissioned or transitions to a different technology, the authorities need to be kept up to date on that. And ideally, well, not ideally, this needs to be done in advance so that you don't have any problems along the way, so that when you're ready to remove your device or change your device, it's all approved by the authorities and there's no disruptions to your timelines. And then I say life cycle management. So this is the entire life cycle of your product in a changing world. This is, you've sometimes heard the phrase regulatory intelligence, but this is very much around staying on top of, regulations will change, market conditions will change, there will be amendments to legislation. And by staying on top of these, you're able to adjust both from a regulatory perspective, but also if needed from a device perspective, so that you can stay ahead of any of these and have no disruption in supply or other. The last thing anyone wants is their device pulled from the market for a non-compliance. It is unfortunately more frequent than people know. So it is something that companies do need to stay on top of. And then just the final slide of us before we can dive into the discussions. So bringing a device to market is an incredibly exciting journey. There's nothing more exciting than being it, and passionate entrepreneurs. It's an amazing place to be, but the regulatory landscape is a difficult one, and it's cumbersome. So without meticulous support, the likelihood of getting to market does diminish dramatically. So no matter how strong the faith in your product and your concepts are, the odds are stacked against you. So please, my one message to everyone here is do focus on the regulatory requirements, because it is what will get your product to market. And thank you for that. And looking forward to chatting with you about it.
Yeah, thank you. It was a fantastic presentation so far. I do have some kind of follow-up questions, and also from our audience perspective, if you have some questions, you can type in the Q&A section, and we'll tackle them as they come. But some of the questions I had kind of come up with as I was listening to this. One of the things, I know this was focused quite a bit on the European market, because that's where most of your experience is. But is there a shift because of MDR and IVDR and AI Act and all this other regulatory landscape in Europe? We used to see that companies would do, you know, back like 10 years ago, companies would focus quite a
Yeah,
bit on the European market first or in parallel to the US market. Do you see a shift where people are looking maybe more to the US market now first?
absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Yes, there is, unfortunately, for a lot of the European markets, we are seeing a shift in a lot of companies now choosing the FDA because it's not that it's easier per se. The requirements are still very strict to get a product to market in the US. It's just that it is a, how should we say, it's a more straightforward pathway. It's a slightly easier, it's a clearer path to navigate, I think, than we've seen in EU, particularly to your point about EU MDR. It has really, and a lot of the historical problems we've had with notified bodies and clients being and people being able to get their products through the notified bodies. So yeah, absolutely. Just to touch on a point though, and something you mentioned both, and I just want to bring just expand a little on that as well. I would say, it's just because it's one of the things that I deal with quite a lot is if you are looking to bring a product to market, if it's US first, that's great. But if you are looking to do more than one market, particularly EU and US, do consider the requirements for both when you're writing your technical documentation, particularly clinical trials, where I mentioned where it can be region specific, because the general rule of thumb is it'll cost you to write your tech docs and your clinical trials and do prepare for both markets will cost you will be about 30% more effort. But if you then have to, once you have it in one market, to then go back and do everything, redo everything for a second market will cost you about 70%. So it's a 30-70 rule. So if you are planning on going into more than one market, consider that in your planning and then go, say, if it's a US first approach, get everything that you need for the EU, write it into your tech docs, right? Because it is very similar. The clinical trials are similar. The technical documentation criteria are very similar, but they're not the same. So that little bit more effort you need is well worth doing while you're doing it. Otherwise, we've seen a lot of clients having to go back and redo a whole set of clinical trials just to get one extra endpoint, for example, or to include a certain population type that they could have done when they were running the trial initially.
Yeah, no, I agree. I also believe the harmonization that the FDA has done over the last year or so with 1345 hopefully also reduces that 30%, maybe a little bit
Yeah,
in the coming years. So that's a good strategy to go,
yeah,
even if you don't
yeah,
go both markets right away, to plan for that.
yeah,
Hi, going back to the analogy you started with, the stool with the three legs. I know we talked quite a bit about the regulatory and the device of the device, but the funding part, and we know the funding has been challenging over the last couple of years. Does regulatory strategy improve or maybe not improve? Chance of funding? Are they linked in some way? And can we use regulatory strategy to kind of get a better funding landscape?
absolutely. And this is something that I talk about a lot with clients and with others, is that if certainly in the initial rounds of funding, it's very much around the technology. But when we're starting to talk more seriously about a product on the market, by having a clear regulatory strategy, by having, a bit like I showed in the slide where you have it broken down, you know what you need to do when, you have an idea, you can start costing each of those steps. you have your timelines, you have your costs associated with it. And normally, if we were managing it, um, we would put in milestones that have to be hit as well, so that everyone's aware of where they are. And where it's so crucial for funding is that then you're not just talking about the device and the technology. You're also looking at the regulatory strategy of how you're going to get there. You know how much you need, you know what your timelines are, and you also know what you need to, what your milestones are. So, and that's twofold. A, when you're approaching investment, they can see that you understand what you're doing, which, as we know, it's all about risk, decreases the risk of your product getting to market considerably, because you have a plan, your timelines, the people you need to be involved, the funding you need, the milestones you need to hit. You have that all in place, which drastically decreases the risk of investing in you, which obviously then increases, how should we say, the amount of funding you receive for the amount of share capital you have to give up, the cost of that, if you want to call it that. The other thing about it is so like I said, and then the other thing with it as well is that you're not trying, when you're looking at funding, you're not overfunding or underfunding. If you know that you need, say, 10 million or 3 million or 1 million, depending on your device, you can concentrate on the amount that you need. You're not spending all of your effort trying to, say, get 10 million, you only need 5. And that's the real sort of, so there's two crucial elements to it.
Cool. We also, you mentioned a little bit about using IT systems, say, to support regulatory strategy. Are there any common mistakes, though, that people make when they use these systems?
The first one, I would say, and I imagine this is no surprise to you, is they start using them too late. That's the first one. As part of your regulatory strategy, and it's a great reminder, you want to include things, when I say milestones, things like what software you need, the cost of it, when you're going to use it. And my advice is always, the earlier the better. But you get professionals and let them do it for you. One of the big mistakes, as I think I mentioned, is that a lot of companies try and do it themselves. We'll develop our own software systems, and it always takes so much longer and ends up costing so much more. So the earlier the better is the short answer. And there's a lot of great softwares out there, and the price, relatively speaking, is very affordable.
Yeah, I agree on that. Specifically EQMS. I think we still see people doing a lot of paper or electronic, but on things like Google Drive or OneDrive without a proper EQMS, and the cost isn't that much a difference. But you pay a lot in the end by not doing the right things.
You do, and that includes, and that plays very much into, your cybersecurity risks as well, particularly when you're talking about, and that's not just people stealing your idea. The minute you have particularly patient data or personal data, you risk the fines, and the risk will shut will shut you down. It will kill your company and your device straight away. So it's not worth doing. It's really not.
Yeah. No, and also efficiency. I mean, specifically in the kind of the climate we are, where people are global, they're remote, and having proper electronic systems that can be accessible from anywhere with the right security and the right sort of auditing to it is to me an efficiency play as much as it is it's a cost or cybersecurity issue.
Absolutely, and a future-proofing issue, because as your company grows, cannot, things can't be done manually because it
Yeah,
just costs too much, and it's too slow, and you're reliant on people bottlenecks, you know. Whereas if you have a system in place that can be accessed by everyone, you can then, as you grow, your system can grow. You can start connecting it to different systems as well. AI is everyone's talking about AI at the moment. You can start connecting in AI and other things as well. But the most fundamental part of that is having a system in place. And the first, probably the most, well, I would say the most fundamental would be a QMS system. Yeah.
sure. As you mentioned, also, to bring a product to market, you need a lot of different expertise. And I imagine that some of these expertise come through either consultants or contractors. Are there any specific criterias, or what should you consider when you work with consultants, independent consultants, and contractors?
It's a good question. So obviously, I would separate out consultants and contractors slightly, although they are interchangeable depending on the company that you use. Some consultancies will supply you with people who will be doing the job that you need doing. But ideally, if you are choosing a consultancy, you want a higher level of management across it. You want someone who can understand your business, so is embedded in your business, understands it, understands your market plans, where you're going, so that they're not just doing a specific task. So say it's writing a component of your technical documentation, because they can do that, but they also need to understand your market plans, where you're going, your strategy, so that they can write it to within reason. And it comes back, sorry, a little bit to that point I made about industry best practice. So they can write it to a way that conforms to where you're looking to go, obviously within the regulatory guidelines, of course. And the same really for contractors as well. Just whoever you're bringing in, they need the right mindset to onboard and to work with you at the end of the day to achieve what you need to do.
One question around those tools that came
Yeah.
around IT tools. Can you give some examples, assuming we are thinking beyond the likes of tools like MS Office? So I think these are like EQMS tools, right?
Yeah. So tools or systems is probably the right word. So tools or systems. I mean, tools are things like AI. Some of your document, your machine learning, your document creation, that sort of thing. NIT does have a suite of tools, but in this case, it's more around the systems themselves. So, QMS systems, data management systems, people like yourselves, of us who are able to do that. So, certainly in a startup environment, we're talking more systems, than tools, just to add some
Yeah.
clarity around that.
Yeah. But some names, for example, I could say EQMS Word, or in a document management systems, things like ALM tools. So we have, and I say ALM, part of that is our sister company sells ALM tool called Matrix ALM, but also EQMS tools like, Viva has I forget what they call, Quick Vault EMS
Yeah,
tool. There is the Greenlight Guru. There is
yeah,
Collio. There's a lot of these kind of e-commerce tools, and they don't cost. Like, you can start slow, right? So you don't need
yeah.
a large package. You can start a slow package, and you can work out those tools as they go. Um,
Exactly. No, exactly.
uh, this was a question on cost. Not sure if you have a direct answer, because I think the answer would be it depends. But there's a cost. What does it typically cost to get a CE mark?
A bit, yeah, a bit like time to market. It depends, and you're right, Abbas. It depends on the main cost. is that the two biggest costs are the classification of your device and whether or not you need clinical trials. Those are the two big cost factors. So there's a large cost difference between a type 1 device versus a type 2 and certainly a 3, where a 3 you will have clinical trials, possibly also with a 2. So those are the two main, I would say, cost drivers.
Hey, that's all the time we had today for this. Thank you again, Rowan. It was a very interesting and a very knowledgeable, at least for me. I learned a lot of stuff. So thank you again for taking the time. Thank you, audience, for listening. We have some questions we could not get to. We'll follow up in an email and try to answer those questions. And just a reminder again, this presentation will be available, this recording will be available to you probably by tomorrow on email. But thank you, and you all have a rest of the day. Good rest of the day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Really enjoyed it, and lovely to
Okay.
chat again, Abbas.
Yes.
Take care all.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Bye.